Jim, episode 2.
Episode 2. We did it. We're going to at least say we didn't quit after the first one, right?
Exactly.
We're still in.
It's definitely starting to gain some traction already, so that's nice from the first
Yes,
episode.
it's very good. It's very good.
Getting a lot of texts from friends and stuff too that are enjoying it.
I have to, and at least we can say now there are dozens in the audience. So.
Exactly.
Right.
Dozens,
right? So, what are you reading right now, Jared?
Yeah, so right now I am actually, we're going to do a Joseph Conrad episode coming soon. So I'm reading a lot of Joseph Conrad. Mostly just been reading essays lately.
We're doing today too.
Yes. Yeah, we're hoping that there's a consistent arc with all of this, that each of these people kind of speak to each other. They're all enlightening us to a new idea and kind of digging deeper into what we're trying to accomplish, which is to get people to think maybe a little differently about these works. So
enlighten, as it were.
As it were, yeah, which makes sense for today. So what essay do we got today?
Pardon me? Oh, what essay?
So what's the essay we're rolling into today?
So we are reading today Kant's An Answer to the Question, What is Enlightenment? Okay. Which he wrote in 1784, at least it was published in 1784. We're using the Ted Humphrey translation from Hackett, and which is readily available out there on the webs, as it were.
Yeah, I'll put it in the show notes.
Yeah, and a little something too about this. It's an interesting piece. I mean, it's been very influential going forward after it. And it was, I mean, to the point that, and maybe we'll cover this at some point, Foucault wrote a famous essay about this essay that I think you can almost, bookend modernity in many ways, like the high watermark being Kant's essay, and then like the an important announcement about postmodernity, with Foucault's essay. But interestingly, this was published in, I guess, basically it was a magazine. Okay. It was like the Berlin Monthly or the Berlin Weekly, I guess is what it would be. And there had been some controversy about free speech rights, conscience rights for clergy in the Prussian state. And the magazine sent a call out for papers, for essays on this. And there were many submissions, and Kant was kind of the one that won the day. And so it's interesting. So nothing's new, right? So, and I think it was actually, if I remember correctly, it was controversy over clergy's views about marriage and how relevant that was to the state and stuff like that. Nothing is new, right?
Yeah.
Right? So, and that's the origin of the essay. Okay. And I love this essay in many ways. I mean, because one, it's this important document of one of modernity's first statements for itself as being consciously modern, right? Like this is the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment kind of came a little later to the German-speaking world, and now you have Kant declaring what it would be to do this, right? So it's this interesting moment of self-consciousness, which it will be important for me. Things we'll talk about down the road, and moreover, I think just as a matter of pedagogy, you can teach a lot of very important ideas about Kant,
for sure,
or a lot of Kant's very important ideas from just this one relatively small, relatively easy essay by Kant.
Yeah, I think it gives a really good overview to, especially if you're going into like Critique of Pure Reason or some of his others, it really gives you a good kind of taste of what he's trying to accomplish in those. I think it also, for me, as I'm reading it, immediately all I could think about was ordered liberty, and that's all. It's in my brain from Edmund Burke, which is interesting because Edmund Burke is kind of the father of what we would call conservatism. And Kant oftentimes is not really considered in conservative circles. But as I'm reading this, I'm like, no, he wants order for sure. It's just a matter of he wants radical freedom when it comes to knowledge, especially when we're talking about the post-scientific boom that happens. And as we talked about in the last episode, of this kind of renewed sense of who we are and what we can accomplish, that he shows up and says, well, now let's do that in the mind too. Let's dig deep into epistemology and what we mean by knowledge. So to me, but he doesn't call for a revolution in the sense of like overturn everything, because that's what is required to know. Rather, argue your way through the problems by using logic and allowing people to think for themselves, which I think is it makes sense with Burke's understanding of it as well. But I think if we had a whole episode about the two of them, I could definitely say a lot. But that's all I could read through, or most of what I kind of read through this actually.
Yeah, that might be an interesting exercise to rub Burke against this at some
Yeah.
point. And I think we'll see as we go on, there is a major confrontation between Freud and
Oh,
Kant
for
here
sure.
that we'll see as this unfolds. Yeah.
Absolutely. Well, you want to start with the first paragraph? I think it's a good way to go.
Do you mind to tear into that?
Let's do it. So it says, and this is, I like whenever they number paragraphs. So it's paragraph 1 here. But it says, enlightenment is man's emergence from his self-imposed immaturity. Immaturity is the inability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. This immaturity is self-imposed when its cause lacks not in lack of understanding, but in lack of resolve and courage to use it without guidance from another. Sapere aude. Have courage to use your own understanding. That is the motto of the Enlightenment. And I actually prefer the translation "dare to know." I think that's way more interesting. to say that.
Like you'll hear "dare to know." There's a number of translations. I like the one I actually use in class. I forget whose translation it is. Rather than self-imposed immaturity, which is fine, it's self-imposed tutelage. And I really like tutelage, right?
Interesting.
It has that in English that implication of you're being tutored by someone else, you're being taught by someone else, that you're under the intellectual direction of someone else. So that's my favorite trend. I have no idea what's closer to the German, but I find tutelage sort of makes the point really well here.
For sure.
Right? Yeah, and so the interesting thing about this and kind of the famous thing. There's all these cases where you would have swore that something was a direct quotation from a text, and when you go to it, it's really not there. Okay, like if someone asked me, how does Kant answer the question, "What is enlightenment?" He would say, "To be enlightened is to think for yourself." Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think a lot of people say that, though he doesn't literally say that in this essay, right? Okay, it is how's he put it in that paragraph we just read? It is. The ability to use one's understanding without guidance from another. Okay, so that means close to thinking for yourself. Okay, and I think at this late date, when people hear enlightenment is to think for yourself or to use your understanding without the guidance of another, we immediately go to so what Kant's saying is do your own thing, you do you, right? If you understand yourself to be a chicken, then you're a chicken. Okay. Right. And nothing could be further from what Kant is saying here. In fact, I would say, okay. And it might even be too far from that for comfort. Right.
Yeah.
And I think an important way to make that point is I want to draw our attention to another selection from Kant. This is, I'm taking this from the Cambridge edition of a collection of essays appended with his short treatise on the limits of religion within the bounds of reason alone. By Cambridge published it, and in there you have the essay, "What is it to orient oneself in thinking?" which is a banger essay for Kant. Mm-hmm. And it ends with a footnote. Okay, and I think this footnote really, really helps us understand what's going on in the answer to the question of what is enlightenment, and I think just in Kant in general. So if I'll indulge us to read this,
let's do it.
Okay, so this is the footnote to what is it to orient oneself in thinking. So thinking for oneself means seeking the supreme touchstone of truth in oneself, that is, in one's own reason. And the maxim of always thinking for oneself is enlightenment. Okay, so end the quote there. Similar to what we see in the opening paragraph of our essay, right? Mm-hmm. The thinking for oneself means seeking the supreme touchstone of truth in oneself. Okay, the maxim of always thinking for oneself is enlightenment. So to be enlightened, here he says explicitly, is to think for yourself. Okay, now, and once again, does that mean, hey, Jared can declare himself to be a tree now if that's how he understands himself? Okay, no. All right. So Kant goes on in this, going back to what is it to orient oneself in thinking. Now there is less to this than people imagine when they place enlightenment in the acquisition of information. For it is rather a negative principle in the use of one's faculty of cognition, and often he who is richest in information is the least enlightened in the use he makes of it. Okay, so end quote there. What's Kant saying? He's saying, okay, to be enlightened isn't just to know some facts. It's not just data access. Okay. The enlightened person doesn't just simply have more information, the unenlightened person. Okay. At least in the sense that Kant's concerned with. Or now continuing with Kant. To make use of one's own reason means no more than to ask oneself, whenever one is supposed to assume something, whether one could find it feasible to make the ground or the rule on which one assumes it into a universal principle for the use of reason. This test is one that everyone can apply to himself, and with this examination he will see superstition and enthusiasm disappear, even if he falls far short of having the information to refute them on objective grounds, end quote. Okay. So what is it to think for yourself? It's to only think in the terms of the universal. That's what he's saying there. He's like, so if I'm thinking for myself, if I'm actually able to give good reasons for what I think, and they are my reasons, okay, those reasons in Kant's view, in as much as they're reasons, should be accessible to any other rational being. Okay. So for Kant, thinking for yourself is not doing your own thing. Thinking for yourself is doing what any other rational being would do. It's not thinking your own thing. It's thinking what any other rational being would think, given the information, given the laws of logic, et cetera, et cetera.
Which is why I can't call myself a cat, because you can't see that.
Exactly.
And you can't.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. I can't just decide I'm a cat today and then say that is a matter of reason, unless I can give reasons that anyone else would be able to recognize as rational beings under those same conditions. Okay. So what Kant's making a case now, objectivity and subjectivity are very complicated in Kant, and maybe we'll get into that, but he's actually making a case for a kind of objectivity, an extreme kind of objectivity here. It's like to be enlightened, the fully, maximally, ideally enlightened person would only act based on reasons that were accessible to all rational parties.
Yeah.
Period. Full stop.
You almost have an interesting sort of bipolar of like individualism in a certain sense, but then anti-individualism in another, right? That the true like full mind is not just the individual. It can't be. I find that fascinating because oftentimes the Enlightenment gets dumped on because they see it as purely an individualist revolution. But Kant here is saying something much different, for sure. And it seems like he's kind of speaking both sides of the coin, which to me is a good thing. I think we should be able to celebrate the individual, but not individual in the sense of outside of the mind of the culture or the mind of, other rational beings. Yeah.
So a 20th century Kantian philosopher, kind of one of my great philosophical heroes, I'd say influences that like sort of overestimate. Like when you start saying I have influences, it makes it sound like somebody cares what you say, right? Like, you know what I mean? But one of the philosophers I most admire from the 20th century is the Kantian philosopher Wilfrid Sellars, right? And Sellars sort of makes this point by saying, what it is to be in what he calls the space of reasons. Okay. And that's basically what Kant means by to be enlightened. What it is to be in the space of reasons is to move from what I think to what we would think. Okay. It's to move from an I to a we, where the we is some like community of ideally rational inquirers. Okay. But that doesn't, but there is an individualism to this, because what Kant is saying is you are enlightened. You are, in Sellars' terms, you are in the space of reasons to the degree to which that you do this for yourself. Like the reasons that you cite are universally accessible, but they are in fact authentically your reasons for doing this.
Yeah.
Okay. So that like you understand and you accept the principles that are grounding these claims. So it's an individualism embedded in a necessary universalism.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's to come to conclusions about things, not just because Professor so and so told me, but rather
Right.
because I thought this thing through.
Yeah.
And that's where I think he also, I mean, especially in this first paragraph, he calls it a lack of resolve and courage to go without the guidance of another. Because you can turn the guidance of another into a crutch. And all of a sudden now you're just accepting things for what Professor so and so or whatever, somebody says, rather than thinking through, wait, I've agreed with you all the way up to this point, and now I'm going to separate myself from that specific moment, because that takes courage. It takes resolve to say, yeah, I mean, we are going to disagree now, and I think that a lot of people do lack that resolve. They would rather just listen to, and this is how I think a lot of people fall into ideologies, right? That because the ideological stance tells me that I'm supposed to think a certain way, well, then I'm going to do it. Rather than saying, wait, that doesn't, that doesn't bode well with what I think is true.
Yeah, he said he gets a little nasty in the answer to the question essay, where he's, if you're not enlightened, it's a matter of laziness, both individual and collective laziness, right?
Yes.
And so going back to the quotation from "What is it to orient oneself in thinking?" He does say, if you're enlightened in the sense that you're in the space of reasons and you insist only in operating both practically and theoretically in terms of reasons that are universally accessible, we like he says, you'll overcome superstition and enthusiasm whether or not you have the information to do so or not, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's like I think he sees basically what enlightenment is it's sort of like a prophylactic against BS.
Yeah, that's
Right. If indeed you are enlightened and you insist only to like exist in this space of reasons, then good or bad information being in your environment is not going to really matter that much,
Mm-hmm.
because you're going to insist on the reasons, right? And
I,
and
I
there's,
love
there's
that
a
he
whole
says,
theory of education built into this.
yes. Well, I love that he says enthusiasm there too, because I kind of read that as like, I think of political rallies and how
Yeah.
sometimes like, well, because the enthusiasm's so high, because everybody's excited right now, I'm just going to agree with whatever's said. And that's left and right. But I immediately think of like that. There's that famous picture of a whole group of German people saluting the Hitler salute. There's that one guy standing there with his
Just
arms
one dude.
crossed, and he's like, "No, I'm not doing this."
Yeah.
He's enlightened,
Yeah.
right? Like that.
He's
That's the
enlightened.
enlightened man,
Yeah,
because
he's
you
enlightened.
don't fall into just the wave of enthusiasm.
Yeah, that's exactly what Kant means there, right? And do you mind if I finish that
Let's do
paragraph
it.
from? Okay, so going back to what is it to orient oneself into thinking, Kant continues: for he, that is the enlightened person, is using merely the maxim of reason self-preservation. Thus, it is quite easy to ground enlightenment in individual subjects through their education. One must only begin early to accustom young minds to this reflection. But to enlighten an age is very slow and arduous, for there are extreme external obstacles which in part forbid this manner of education and in part make it more difficult. End quote.
Mm.
Right. So you can see is that, yeah, he thinks it's not hard. I might dispute this, to teach a young mind to operate in the space of reasons. That's easy. But if we're going to have an age of enlightenment now, then this comes up in the other essay. Have an age of enlightenment, that's a harder thing, because there's
Yes.
these forces external. And I think he means ecclesiastical, political authorities who may be in the way of this, who
Yes.
may not want this so much because they've done pretty well under the self-incurred tutelage model. Right.
For sure. I think there's also other factors, particularly thinking of our current realities, like the commercializing of everything. I think even knowledge oftentimes is commercialized to the point where like I'm only studying because I need to get these grades so that I can go get this job to make this kind of money. It seems like Kant, when he talks about being enlightened, it's not even remotely close to something like that.
Exactly.
I think that that's still a good life. It's still something that you can go accomplish, make a good living for your family. Fine. But if you really want to be enlightened, you have to go much further than that. And you have to treat knowledge a little more precious than that.
Yeah. And there's another quotation maybe we'll go to here in a second, if you're cool with it.
Yeah.
For Kant, like what makes humans distinct, Okay, I think this is a big claim, but what makes humans distinct, what makes us subject to enlightenment, is that we can act for the sake of duty.
Hmm.
Okay, that he in his view, we can act without a motive outside of just simply it being the right thing. Okay,
Yeah.
whether we mean that right thing in terms of theoretical reason, it's we accept a certain position because it's simply truth conducive to do so. What do
Hmm.
you get out of it but truth? Nothing, right? And he also thinks we can be motivated practically, just simply, we're going to do something because it is simply the right thing to do, right? It's what reason demands. What do you get out of it? Nothing, but the fact that it's what reason demands. And so for Kant, anytime you're acting, this is where the individualism thing comes in this paradoxical way. Anytime you're acting on some kind of principle that is coming outside of just simply what is dictated by reason, he would say you're being guided by something external and you're essentially animalizing or enslaving yourself to something external. Okay. So he would say if your education is entirely based on, hey, I need, and of course we have to do this, right? But I need to, survive in the economy, and I need to get ahead, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Kant would say that is essentially an inhuman, right? And that's pretty strong. But I think he would say something like that. It's an inhuman education. It's an unenlightening education because it is putting you in the service of forces outside of you, okay,
Yeah.
that are, not motivated simply by reason alone.
Yeah. Well, I'm sure at some point we'll probably get into his ideas of passions as well and how that relates to the intellect.
Yeah.
But I was interested in regard to our previous episode, and actually, I don't know if you want to get deeper into the essay before we get into. I would love to talk about Freud's response to
Yeah.
this.
Let's come back to Freud in a bit.
Okay, we'll
Yeah.
come back to Freud.
Yeah. So
Um,
can I make one more general point about
yep.
Kant? I won't. I won't read the quotation, but this is referring to something from the Critique of Practical Reason, where Kant makes this point that he says like Kant sees the world in terms of laws. Okay,
Hmm.
and he's fascinated by the fact that laws of nature do not ask the permission of their subjects, right?
Yeah.
In order to get obedience. Okay, so if I drop my coffee mug, if I release my coffee mug, it's going to fall to the earth and it gets no vote in this whatsoever. Okay.
Right.
And so that universal principle will be followed, full stop. And he says there's these other kinds of laws of reason, and by that he means laws of like theoretical reasoning,
Hmm.
and laws of like practical reason, okay, moral duties, right? And those oddly require the participation of their subjects in order for them to occur. Okay, so like whether or not like we don't really vote in what the laws of logic are, okay,
Hmm.
but Kant thinks there's a kind of spontaneity within us such that we have to like be, well, one, we have to be trained to use them in some ways, and moreover we have to like be willing to hold ourselves to that. Okay,
Yeah.
like we have to be willing not to fall into bad reasoning. Okay, likewise, like we don't decide the laws of morality in Kant's view, but the
Hmm.
laws of morality have no grip unless we submit ourselves to them.
Hmm.
Okay, so for Kant, this idea of operating by the universal because it's the universal always presupposes the participation of a free or spontaneous being in that. Do you see that? So like in being enlightened, in being in the space of reasons, right? In in operating by reason alone, Kant would say that is the most free act that can happen,
Yeah.
right? Because you're suspending all these other things and you're only operating by those principles of reason, and it's up to you whether you do that or not, right?
Yeah.
So there is a very individual thing going on in enlightenment, but it's always an individual who is sort of submitting herself to these broader universal principles.
And that makes total sense for this to be post-scientific method of the kind of discovery of certain laws of nature, and then our ability to just to go into those even deeper. And within practical science or material science, it's the ability to manipulate some of those laws. But then here he's saying, no, these are consistent. These aren't something that you manipulate. It's something that you participate within, and you help to enact in the broader society around you, really.
Right. Right. Exactly.
Yeah, it's
Okay.
interesting.
Should we go?
Well, I've got just one type of thing here, or one thing I wanted to mention, because it's interesting how when people hear things like, an individual enlightened or whatever, they often think of individualism, right? But there's not a single call in here to like burn down the educational institutions or get rid of, the ability to pass down knowledge,
Yeah.
or the necessity of listening to other people to educate you. And I love that he says, so he brings up the idea of revolution. He says, and this is on paragraph 4. He says, perhaps a revolution can overthrow autocratic despotism and profiteering or power-grabbing oppression, but can never truly reform a manner of thinking. Instead, new prejudices, just like the old ones they replace, will serve as a leash for the great unthinking mass. I loved that quote.
Yeah.
Because what he's saying is like revolutions. Yeah. I mean, if you've got some tyrannical overarching, dictator that is robbing you of freedom, especially your ability to think, then at times maybe that's right. But when it comes to thinking itself, your ability as an individual to think for yourself, you have to be careful, because those revolutions will end up with just new prejudices, new tyrannies, new different things. Yeah. And so he's saying within the freedom of the individual, you have to be able to think beyond those prejudices, think beyond the new things that are in come, whatever revolution happens.
If your revolution is based on enthusiasm, it's anti-enlightenment.
That's right.
You're right, as he defines it. And remember, once again, enlightenment it's the prophylactic protection against that kind of thing. Right. And also there's some interesting moments too in this essay where he's clearly like sucking up to the Prussian state too. Right? Don't crush us, guys. You can trust enlightenment. It's going to be okay. Right. And I think that brings us to what I think is an important and maybe a dangerous for us topic that comes up here is it's the free speech stuff. Mm-hmm. Okay. That he gets into, and he intentionally uses the example of a clergyman. Okay. Mm-hmm. Because once again, what's occasioned this essay, it was this call for papers from a magazine that was dealing with a controversy about, as I understand it, clergy academic freedom. Okay. Mm-hmm. And it has this interesting point here where he says, okay, look, and this goes to your bit about order and disorder. So for Kant, remember, Kant is like the most stringent, you make a promise, you abide it guy that there's ever been. Okay. Yep. And, when the question comes up, like what is enlightenment for a pastor? Okay, well, Kant says the pastor, in as much as he or she has contracted with a church, must speak the doctrine of that church when they're in the role of the pastorate. Okay, mm-hmm. But he says, privately, they must be allowed to conduct any inquiry and publish its results as they see fit based on reason. Okay. So he makes this distinction between what he calls public reason and private reason. And it might mm-hmm. invert what we think one would mean there. And so by public reason, he means what is promulgated by a scholar acting as a scholar. And I think what he means is reasons that are accessible to the public, whoever they are. Yeah. Okay. As opposed to what he's calling private, which is now we've limited the results that we'll allow here. Okay. Yeah. So it's private. And he does say, so if a pastor has a contractual obligation for certain doctrine, then when standing in that pastor should abide that doctrine. And if they can't, move on. Okay. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, that person should be allowed, in his view, when publishing as a scholar, to operate by purely public reason. Yeah.
Which tells me he's also pro-institution, right?
Yes.
That if you're going to operate within an institution, you should abide by the way it reasons.
Exactly. Or he might even say, even if it doesn't reason, if it's just a matter of what he calls elsewhere pathological, not in the sense of diseased, but in the sense of pathos. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If it operates by pathological commitment, not by reason, you would say, well, here's the deal. You signed up. Okay. Yep. If you need to move on, that's fine. But if you signed up, you have to abide this. Okay. But at the same time, though, he doesn't think the ecclesiastical authorities, and here I think he's saying, nor the Prussian state mm-hmm. can tell us what we publish or don't publish as scholars.
That's awesome.
It's awesome. Yeah. I think it's
that's brilliant.
It's brilliant. Okay. And I think, now, and there's an interesting point that comes up too
Can
in
I read
paragraph
a quick
6.
quote to
Yeah,
that
go for it. Yeah,
point,
please,
actually?
by all means. Yeah.
So in paragraph 5, right towards the end, he even says that uh, it would be absurd. Well, this isn't, I'm giving it some context, but basically it would be absurd for a pastor to be immature, because he says, for that the spiritual guardians of a people should themselves be immature. It's an absurdity that would ensure the perpetuation of absurdities.
Yeah.
So if you have a non-thinking or non-rational, or at least someone who's maybe afraid to get into those whatever scholarly work might take them, or wherever that might take them, just because of an institutional commitment, then they would be immature. And for him, that means lack courage and lack,
Yeah.
the resolve to do these kinds of things. And we don't need those kind of spiritual guardians. We need ones who are
No.
willing to take reason to its limits.
And it seems like for Kant that would require an honest commitment to openness to having your mind changed.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And because this is where he goes in paragraph 6, where he says, I don't like people swearing oaths.
Yeah.
Like he actually said, he thinks it would be morally wrong to swear an oath that says you would never change your mind about something, because that would be to sort of like forfeit your human dignity as a denizen in the space of reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And he doesn't think you can, and he thinks you can't commit as a community that we'll never change our mind about something, because it's then like to commit like all of our descendants to sort of like a violation of their dignity as humans to decide for themselves. Okay. So it's interesting, like, and I think what he's saying, back to what you were up to, is how can I trust my pastor if my pastor hasn't in principle said, hey, I'm a fair dealer here, and I could have my mind changed.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see? Otherwise, there's
Right.
this worry that am I putting myself under the tutelage of someone who is themselves under a tutelage,
Mm-hmm.
and that leads to like deeply dark skeptical questions, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right. Which again, to me, I still think it's such an interesting kind of bipolar of the individual and the community, that you have a true individualism in regard to the ability to think freely, but you still have to live among people. And so, and even the way a people think connects each other, right? It's just interesting. The inability to swear oaths is an interesting one too, because the kind of political community and the certain kind of commitments you're willing to say, well, I'm not going to run stop signs because it's dangerous, but I didn't take an oath, to do that. But as an American, it's a commonality, and by using reason, I can figure out that if I run stop signs, number one, I'll probably get pulled over, but number two, I could potentially kill somebody. But I didn't take an oath to do that.
Who do you trust more at the four-way stop? The impetuous 16-year-old kid who just wanted the driver's license, who signs the document committing himself to the motor vehicle code of the state of Kansas, right? Just because it's the only way he could get his license.
Yep.
Or Jared now, who understands, like, look, we've got to take turns of the four-way stop, because if we don't, there's going to be death and mayhem here, in the streets of Atchison.
Exactly.
Who can reason his way through it. Like, who do you trust more to actually follow the law? I trust Jared rather than the impetuous 16-year-old,
Right.
because Jared's operating by the space of reasons. He understands the rule, and he desires it because it's the right thing, not because of some other motive, right? And I think Kant, now maybe, and we'll get into this many, many times in the future, I'm sure, whether this is true or not, Kant thinks the more enlightened we are, the less we're subject to civil authority, and civil authority can then recede. He does at the end of the essay. We can recede civil authority to make room for enlightenment, and things will become more ordered. Now, we might wonder, and this is where maybe Freud will knock on the door in a minute here, wonder if that's really going to be the case. Okay. Yeah. But that's that for him, and I think this is the vision of all Enlightenment thinkers, is that if we just got people operating by reason rather than by authority, we would have a better ordered world, right?
Yeah, and you would need a whole lot less laws.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah, exactly. He thinks he would need fewer laws, right? Um, so can I? This is a similar point. I'm going to take us back to maybe paragraph 2.
Okay.
Okay. I won't read it aloud, but there, it's where he goes off on laziness and cowardliness, right? And he says, look, it's really easy to be unenlightened because then you have, he says, what is it, a doctor to decide your diet for you. You have a pastor decide right and
Yep.
wrong for you. You have a professor decide which books you should read, okay, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. So you're going to defer to authority. You're going to
Mm-hmm.
defer to authority. All right. And better would it be to be enlightened. Now, okay, that makes a lot of sense, or maybe a lot more sense, in 1784, when pretty much one person in in terms of basic education could understand the cutting edge of science, or the cutting edge of health policy, the cutting edge of political theory, all these things. Okay, whereas now that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, like even the best educated person is not going to be able to operate without tutelage at all when it comes to their diet and the books they should read and right and wrong, et cetera, et cetera. There's too much, like, because of the Enlightenment, there's too much information.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So like when I read this paragraph, I thought, oh my gosh, what would Kant say about anti-vax?
Yeah.
Because there's a certain level at which you and we are being asked to take something on authority. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I am in no position to actually wade into that literature and make a
Exactly.
reasoned decision about it. So at some point, it seems like what enlightenment's going to be, and this is maybe distressing, is being able to give reasons for the authorities that you defer to.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't see a way around that. You know what I mean? Whereas, and I think in a lot of ways, what we're seeing now with certain, like contemporary movements is you're in, like, it's obvious, there's lots of people declaring themselves to be chickens and things like that now. That would be contrary to what Kant is saying here. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, what do you do with someone who says, I'm just not going to trust medical authorities anymore?
Mm-hmm.
Is that a Kantian enlightened or unenlightened view?
Yeah.
Okay. And I think that's a hard question. Okay. I would probably
Yeah.
come out and say that's an unenlightened, and by Kant's terms, it's an unenlightened view. Because there are reasons to be given for the track record there, et cetera, et cetera. Do you know what I mean?
Yep.
But so I think there's an interesting question practically to be asked, like, what would it be to be enlightened in this deeply disputed information environment that we're in right now?
Yeah, because I was even thinking about the food and fitness aspect of it, because even amongst the medical community, there's a lot of disagreement around it, and unfortunately, too, the modern natural American diet is mostly garbage, and so you do have to be educated in some sense of what's good for you, and how much certain things you should allow for yourself or not. But even amongst the community, I mean, you go even just a quick online survey, you're going to see people, with all kinds of diet advice, all with
Right.
MDs or whatever, whatever degrees they have. And it's hard because and this is where I think maybe there's a balancing act that if a person wants to be enlightened today, of being able to know just enough about a certain subject to go, okay, this sounds more rational to me than this one. Like if someone was to tell me that I should probably go to McDonald's at least 4 times a week, I'm like, well, I know enough about food to realize that that's a bad idea. Right. So it's kind of one of those things of like, there's so much information out there, but to know at least a little bit about these things and still think for yourself.
Or, an example is, there's a fairly famous physician who is a orthopedic surgeon who's one of the big advocates for the carnivore diet.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which is interesting because is that an authority or not? More than Jim, but there's cardiologists out there too.
Exactly.
And I think a lot of times what happens there is you're given a sense that you're operating according to better reasons, but it's really an authority that's like taken on like the appeal of reason there.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see that? And I think this is this is like a matter of like deep caution for us now. And I don't really have a good answer to this, because it seems that there have been major failings in the authoritative structures in many, across the board, in many, many ways.
Mm-hmm.
In all sorts, we're using health as an example, but in many, many ways. But at the same token, it does seem that we are not in a position to operate completely free of tutelage on many of these issues.
I think that's right. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
even with, especially I think in the of course now we're putting stuff out on YouTube, but I hope we're just kind of getting people to have conversations about this stuff.
Yeah.
But there's
Yeah.
YouTube personalities that all
Yeah,
of a sudden
we're not weighing in on anything here. Yeah.
exactly. But there are YouTube personalities that give the authority just because they have a large following.
Exactly.
And that doesn't really mean much at all to be able to trust their opinion about weighing in on stuff. Like it drives me crazy when I hear people say they've got like an inside scoop on what's going on in Rome. And I'm like, you live in like Virginia or something. What are you talking about? Like that doesn't make any sense to me.
Yeah.
But yet they become an authority because they've got, 6-figure followings. And it's like the enlightened person should be able to read through that and say, just because you've got a YouTube channel doesn't mean much,
Yeah, that's a great point, Jared, in that, okay, so we could talk about just using the example of diet. All right, maybe you don't have the training, the understanding, or in my case, the IQ to understand the science. Okay. But you might, so there at some point, you're going to take somebody, at their word on something.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. But you may have the training, the understanding, the IQ to discern good or bad sources.
Mm-hmm.
And that may be what counts for enlightenment for us today.
Yes, I think that's right. It reminds me of one time I went to a conference. I was on a panel where we were talking about literature, and I ended up going to a different panel, and they were talking about music theory and like sound theory and stuff. I have never read much about any of that at all. I'm not a musician. I do love music, but I don't create it. But I'm watching this, and I'm watching how they came, because they had a whole full presentation, each one of them, and then they had a discussion afterwards. And I'm watching how they came to these conclusions in the science that they were able to use, and then they proved it by actually showing how it works. Right? I'm like, okay, well, I'm going to have to trust that authority because I saw your process. I saw what it took to get to that place. But if I was to end up at just the end and say, how would I possibly trust your process here, or how would I be able to trust what you just told me when I can't see sound waves, but you're telling me waves exist, right? I've got to know your process.
Yeah, 100%. And so, should we go like how to rub this essay against Freud?
Let's do it. Yeah.
Okay. So, do you have any thoughts on up front?
Well, up front, I had kind of two questions. One was, based off of the other essay we read, does Freud agree with Kant that human beings actually will ever be able to get to this place? And is this a type of narcissism, a kind of different type of narcissism? After we talked about the 3 blows to it, is this just confidence in what human beings are capable of, or is this potentially even a narcissism of sorts? Yeah. So I don't know.
Yeah. So Freud is not as consistent on this as we might have wished him to be. Okay.
Yeah.
It's I think one of your more abiding problems, not with Freud, but a couple of the things he did. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So on the one hand, a difficulty in the path of psychoanalysis, which we talked about last time, should lead you to be very skeptical about what Kant is laying out here as a project, as a social project, because Kant is assuming that there is a sort of relationship humans can have toward their reasons that is entirely trustworthy. Okay, because like Freud would point out to you, it's entirely possible. He actually does this in his book, A Future of Illusion, where he says, like, you might have an impeccably good argument for something. And here he's talking about arguments for God's existence. You might have an impeccably good argument for God's existence. That argument could even be sound. Now, Freud would disagree with you on that, but like that argument could even be sound. And yet that has nothing to do with what's actually holding you to the belief.
Hmm.
Like that's what an illusion is for Freud. It's a belief we hold that may or may not be true, that may or may not be rationally groundable, but that has nothing to do with why we hold it. Okay.
Hmm.
And like I think you could look at like Freud's project and other people we talked about, their project of sort of attacking human narcissism is to basically say, hey, look, these events like Copernicus, like Darwin, now like Freud, like Nietzsche, they are revealing to us that humans are subject to illusion in that technical sense, that
Hmm.
we are not really crystal clear about what our real motives are in what we believe and what we do. And that seems to be that we are kind of the playthings of a subconscious background in a lot of ways. Okay, if that's the case, then what Kant is saying here, what would enlightenment be would be, if not impossible, would be something that we should always be suspicious of our claims to having done it.
Yes.
Because who knows what dog in the basement is actually,
Exactly.
like motivating this. Yeah. You see that? And so, all right, and so on one hand, I think we should see what you have here in Freud's essay and Kant's essay is these are the two poles. And this is like
Hmm.
the debate, I think, in modernity, right?
Yeah.
Is something like Kant's enlightenment sustainable in light of the revelation of the unconscious motive for things and the assault on human narcissism that modernity's brought? Okay. It's like, this is the two-edged sword of modernity. Okay. Um, Interestingly, and I find this delicious, is uh, Freud in Future of Illusion uh, does this sort of enlightenment inspired attack on religion, right? And he says,
Hmm.
like we need to enlighten really hard, and we need to get over these beliefs that we take on authority because it's bad for our development as rational beings, et cetera, et cetera. Um, but I think then, like you should expect Freud to be asking himself, though, well, why would you think we could do that? If
Hmm.
indeed we're subject to subconscious subversion, then why would you think we could ever really achieve that? Okay.
Yeah.
Um, and so, and if you think of it, like for Freud to make his case for the unconscious and make his case for unconscious subversion, he has to take the standpoint of a disengaged reason to arrive at that conclusion. But
Hmm.
yet that conclusion seems to like call into question. Okay. And I'm not saying that's a reason to reject Freud's position. It might be a reason to think that humans, as enlightenment in, aspiring beings, are kind of going to paint ourselves in a corner no matter what.
Yes. Yeah, I think too that Freud would likely also question a little bit of Kant's surety that everyone can get into the space of reasons. Does that make
Yeah.
sense? So like
Yeah.
go to a regular like a Walmart or something and tell me most of the people that you run into, you'll be able to enlighten to the fact that you don't need laws anymore. I just
Yeah.
human
Yeah.
experience tells me that's probably not going to happen.
Yeah.
But it's one of those things. That's why I like that it's kind of a double-edged sword, because it is something that we should aspire to for sure. And I do think most people, if they really put in the effort, could figure out a lot. But all of us have those lower motivations, lower passions that are motivating even the ability to say, I know I'm right on anything. Does that make sense? Like I know
Yeah.
for a fact, I know that this very thing is correct. That to me is a bit of a narcissism, because it's like, well, so you're not even willing to question or like
Yeah.
seek out other potential reasons why this might be partially correct, or maybe even 98% correct, but you've got a little something wrong. That to me is like, that's not the enlightened person. And that also, I think, proves Freud's point of like, to me, that's a type of cockiness that's coming out, to say that
Yeah.
I know for a fact that this is correct and I will never change my mind. I just don't think that that's what either of them would want to see.
Yeah. And Freud would say, if like, what are you masking by that surety? How to
Exactly.
masking it out. Yeah. Yeah. And I think this is why, we need a Hegel for our Kant always. And
Absolutely.
that you're going to ultimately, I think, see that this is going to become a dialectical relationship. On the one hand, it doesn't seem like I can get by without taking the disengaged stance of Kantian enlightenment. But at the same time, it seems like that stance is always going to be subject to a kind of subversion from within, by the simple fact that humans have this old hardware that we're running,
Mm-hmm.
okay, that we have to deal with. And so it seems like you're going to have this dialectical relationship because but also I think they're both features and they're both bugs, right? Like,
Mm-hmm.
so like reason not grounded in human embodiment would not be reason applicable to real human beings. Okay. But,
Mm-hmm.
purely embodied beings that did not aspire to disengage rationality would have animalized themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think the lesson for me to come away with on this is we're going to live with a tension here. We're going to live with a
Yes.
tension between, on the one hand, our aspirations to Kantian enlightenment, and on the other hand, the constant like awareness of our fallibility as embodied human creatures.
Yes. And that within I love calling it mystery, to be honest. I know there's probably a better word for it, but within that kind of mystical reality is where human beings can thrive. Because if you know both sides of that coin, then you can recognize your passions, but you can also disengage and be rational about certain things. But I would never want to argue for like a dispassionate person. I think passions are a good thing, and we'll bring Nietzsche in here at some point. And let's thump our chests a little bit, That's okay.
Yeah, well, or to utterly remove all emotional content. This is the case I would make on many grounds. Like to utterly remove all emotional content from some like propositional content, right? Like to completely separate those would be to render a meaningless result. I don't think that's something
Yes.
ultimately graspable by human beings, right?
That's right.
In any at least in any practically relevant sense. And I would even say, even in any theoretical sense, like the idea that we could believe anything that we're not invested in at some level, I think is to deny human embodiment, right?
Yes.
But then,
I also think that leads towards potential sociopaths.
Yeah, exactly.
If you're going to dispassionate.
Yeah. And I think that's the Freudian side of the dialectic right there, is to say, look, if you weren't invested libidinally in this thing, you wouldn't really care about it. Okay.
Yeah.
Then I think the Kantian side of the dialectic is to say, yes, but we can put ourselves at least in some unstable state of reasons.
That's right.
Right. And it's like dealing with that constant instability is sort of that's the life of the mind.
That's right.
For me. Yeah.
Well, great episode, man. I don't know if you got anything else you want to touch on, but I think
no. I mean,
great.
So hopefully we won't be assailed. Hopefully we will not have lost our dozens of listeners on bringing up the vaccine issue. But
exactly.
But we won't shy away from controversy, right?
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. And right. those of you who know us well will probably realize that was like the least controversial thing we did today.
That's true. Awesome. All right. Well, for all of our viewers, sure.
We should encourage our dozens of listeners to like, comment, and subscribe, right?
That's right. Yep. Wherever you listen to your podcasts or on YouTube, and also follow us on Twitter if you'd like. We'll put the handles underneath the show notes and everything. But
I think we'll be coming soon to Substack.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So some of the things. Excellent.
Cool. All right.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks.